probably already know that the recording sessions for the White Album were fraught, argumentative, and bitter. Here the Beatles are, fresh out of India, an experiment that went quickly awry. And not only that, John has a new love in his life, a woman named Yoko Ono, a woman that he insists stay by his side every waking moment, including in the Beatles' sacred space, the recording studio. This is not normal. Not at all. We've heard it from every single Beatle, that the White Album is basically a collection of solo works, rather than the effort of a healthy, functioning band. All of this is well known. Were the White Album sessions really as bad as they say? The answer is no. The truth is, they were even worse than you could possibly imagine. The reality of the situation is so much larger, more complicated than what is typically documented. You know about Yoko sitting on the amp, you know about the horrific recording of Obla D, and I'll still touch upon those stories, but the Beatles' resentments went far, far beyond the recording space. And I'm here to tell you everything. Buckle up. This is part 5 of a series dedicated to one question. Why did the Beatles break up? While you can begin here, I highly suggest you begin with part 1, which will provide an enormous amount of context and help you to begin to understand how these incredible friends, musicians, and cultural icons fell apart so contentiously. What better way to kick off the recording sessions of what would become the White Album than a manic episode from John? Forget his bigger than Jesus debacle. How about I Am Jesus? When John returned from his and Paul's Apple promo campaign in New York, he decided to blow off the stress of the whole ordeal with a multi-day LSD binge. At this period in his life, John's longtime childhood friend, Pete Shotton, spent a significant amount of time at his home, sometimes living there for weeks at a time. And as such, he was given a front row seat to John's various episodes of excitement, depression, and delusion. It is Pete's recollection we will now share, picking up in the middle of one of John's acid trips. Suddenly, John began waving his arms in the air, and out of the blue he announced, in an odd whisper, "I think I'm Jesus Christ." "What was that again, John?" "Yeah," he said, and I could see he was dead serious. "I think I'm Jesus Christ. I'm back. Again." Accustomed as I was to the utter unpredictability of John Lennon, this was one revelation I could never have anticipated. Well then, what are you going to do about it? John called an emergency meeting at Apple offices. The whole entourage and the Beatles sat down, anxious to hear what the pressing matter was. "I've got something very important to tell you. I am Jesus Christ. I have come back again." The Beatles knew John as well as anyone, and thus, they didn't make a big ordeal out of whatever episode John was currently experiencing. They were simply annoyed. "Right," said Ringo. "Meeting adjourned. Let's go and have some lunch." For the first time in their careers, the Beatles no longer had the privilege of walking onto stage or into the studio, playing music and forgetting all the rest, leaving it to the businessmen. They had to attend meetings, provide input, and appoint positions. What quickly became clear was that no one Beatle had the same vision of what Apple Core was. And rather than simplify things, trim here and there, the Beatles decided to explore each and every avenue. And their team, composed almost entirely of yes-men, went along with it. In line with the power dynamics of the band, these business pursuits were primarily led by John and Paul, and it was their egos, their out-of-this-world vision, that would inflate the whole venture to an unsustainable size. George obviously had his projects, many of them wrapped into Apple films, and he was currently helping to produce a film on his mentor, Ravi Shankar.
I was still in India when it started. I think it was basically John and Paul's madness, ego running away with themselves or with each other.
This wasn't George's only resentment. They had been building for some time. It was, of course, George who had brought the Beatles to the Maharishi in the first place, who had encouraged the whole journey. John became equally enamored in the prospect, and Paul and Ringo tagged along. But when they had their falling out with the Maharishi, everything changed. John especially was incredibly bitter toward the guru and would frequently throw barbs his way. And while George may have conceded that the Maharishi was not the perfect, all-knowing figure he posed as, he still admired him and was deeply immersed in the spirituality of the practice. He took any ill word directed toward the Maharishi personally. But perhaps more than anything, he felt musically crushed and disrespected. This wasn't anything new, but as he made close friends in the musical world, such as Eric Clapton, who treated him not as a little brother or a third rung, but as an equal, as someone with more than adequate talent, his resentment of his treatment at the hands of John, and especially Paul, grew to a fever pitch. Then there was the elephant in the room, Yoko Ono. We are not pivoting into the age-old cliche of Yoko broke up the Beatles. That would be patently false, but it would be ignorant to say that she wasn't an element in their breakup, and that she forever changed the dynamics of the band, and specifically, the working relationship between its two most important figures, John and Paul, who shared this otherworldly, once-in-a-lifetime chemistry, who brought out the best in each other, a balance. They were akin to a married couple, a pair of individuals who had spent so much time together, who could communicate without even speaking. And this sort of connection, when impeded, will create a jealousy. The very first day that John brought Yoko into the studio, he escorted her to the control room. She sat there near silent for that first day, and the whole ordeal was terribly awkward for the engineers. Well, the next day, things would get even more awkward. Engineer Jeff Emmerich recalls, taking Yoko by the hand, he led her out of the control room and into the small recording area where the other three Beatles were rehearsing. They completely ignored her at first. To begin with, John sat her down with Mal. A little while later, he motioned her over, and she plunked herself beside him. And that's where she stayed for the remainder of the Beatles' career. From that point on, wherever John went, she went. If he went to the toilet, she'd walk him down the hall and wait outside, hunched down on the floor. When he came out, she'd walk with him back into the studio or control room and sit down beside him again. And you could tell from the icy chill and the looks on the faces of Paul, George, and Ringo that they didn't like it one bit. But by his actions, John was making it eminently clear that, like it or not, there was nothing they could do about it. Once Yoko left the control room, George Martin turned to me, shaking his head sadly. What on earth is John thinking? If the four Beatles ever had any discussion about her being there, it was held out of earshot. But nothing changed. She kept coming in every single day. They didn't even seem to talk all that much. Most of the time, John was working, and she was just sitting quietly by his side. In between takes, she might whisper something in his ear, or ask him if he wanted a cup of tea. But that was about it. Mind you, we noticed that she never actually made the tea, or even offered to do so. She'd simply ask Mal to make a cup. After a few days, it seemed more like she was ordering Mal around than asking him to do things, which is something I am quite sure did not escape his or the other Beatles' attention. Then, one afternoon, in the middle of a backing vocal overdub, John suddenly turned to her and said, "You know, I think you should do this part." Paul, who had been singing the line, gave John a look of disbelief and then walked away in disgust.
And again, I used to just ask John, what's this about? And I said, what is happening here, Yoko? Is it all the sessions? And he told me straight to me. I said, well, when you go home to Maureen and you tell her how your day was, takes you like 2 lines, oh, we had a good day in the studio. And he says, well, we know exactly what's going on. And that's how they started to live. Every moment together.
Trouble was for us, it encroached on our framework that we had going. Basically, it's only ever been the 4 of us in the studio, maybe with Neil and Mal as the 2 roadies, or George Martin up in the control room often. He only ever came down occasionally, or an engineer came down to fix a mic. But that was it. And in our whole recording career, that had been the setup.
We were always wondering how to say, "Could you get off my amp?" without interfering with their relationship. Were the Beatles really as polite and as careful as they claim? Maybe in their words directly to Yoko, but all accounts paint clearly their disgust with the situation. Behind the scenes, they would say some pretty horrific things. And on Yoko's end, could she not feel the tension in the air? Or was she somehow oblivious? In my opinion, the answer, at least in these beginning stages, is yes, and I'm about to prove it. It's time for a deep dive. On June 4th, during overdubs for Revolution, Yoko recorded an audio diary where she discussed in great detail her feelings for John, her feelings about the other Beatles, as well as a number of other topics. I find personally that these recordings humanize Yoko and dispel many of the myths surrounding her. Not to say this is a wholly positive thing. She clearly lives in a world all of her own, and struggles to comprehend or make sense of the feelings of others. Let's examine a selection of audio clips where she discusses her relationship with John, beginning with her describing the importance of John ejaculating inside of her, which she then relates to a number of greater issues John has experienced in his life.
I wish John was in me right now, inside. I was just thinking about it. It's so important that you come inside me instead of coming in my hand or something. You see, and then you said that there's no difference. But if you understand the difference of that, that's when you would really start understanding what it means to love somebody else. And the fact that you gave me your sperm, I don't know, probably at some time of your life, you had a situation where you became scared of a straight relationship, of giving to each other. And instead of giving to a woman, you'd rather spit on the sky or shoot it to the sky, kind of thing. Avoiding something.
I'd be lying if I said I wasn't sharing this due to a bit of crass fascination, but what is most important to glean here is the manner and perspective in which she approaches her relationship with John, almost as if he is an entity to be studied, to be understood. Let's continue.
Another thing that I noticed today that I'm really, really proud of you is that, for instance, your handwriting, it's always been like all your letters were going backwards, leaning backwards, which means tremendous insecurity. But today I've seen that all your letters were leaning forward. Not all, but most of them are sort of leaning forward. It means that you're suddenly starting to, instead of being reticent, starting to become forward and aggressive. Which is like a very normal thing for men. The leaning backwards handwriting is typical of sort of insecure, terribly insecure high school girl or something like that. It's very rare to see it in a man. Did you know that? And when I first saw your handwriting, I was really amazed, because you very rarely see that in a man. And I almost felt that I saw your secret there, something. But now it's starting to change and it's beautiful. Why that insecurity and the passiveness, paranoia? I hate to say it, but I really think that had a lot to do with your marriage.
Here she is again examining John, this time through his handwriting. The implication here is that John was terribly insecure, and that since being with her, he has grown more confident. She caps this all off by blaming Cynthia for said insecurity. This showcases the sinister side of Yoko's perspective. She believes that Cynthia broke him, and that she is fixing him. Is it true that John grew more confident, more emboldened during the beginning stages of his and Yoko's relationship? Yes. Did this confidence then come and go, just as it had throughout his life? Yes. I don't think John and Cynthia had a good relationship, a fact that was most likely due to John's failings, more than Cynthia's, but to hear Yoko directly blame Cynthia is chilling. It's manipulative and cruel, whether that was her intent or not.
John is such a genius. This is the first time that just once in a while I almost get jealous of his style. Which is really amazing because I was never jealous of any artist. Maybe I get excited about his work. I almost feel like kneeling down and kissing his feet.
This is a perfect example of the effect Yoko had on John's confidence and his perspective of himself as an artist. Here is someone, an artist herself, telling John that he is a genius. These recordings are revealing and demonstrate why John fell so deeply in love with Yoko so quickly. Yoko, really, speaks in a similar manner to a guru like Maharishi. She examines John, reads into all of his behaviors, even the way he writes, and then communicates these to him, communicating the ways in which he is growing, in which she is fixing him. She blames his shortcomings not on himself, but on his wife, Cynthia, and then she validates him, his talent, and her love for him. Basically, she tells John exactly what he craves to hear. Again, I am not accusing Yoko of being this manipulative monster, but the end results of her actions and her words are the same, regardless. Now let's get into our thoughts on John's bandmates, starting with Paul.
After the initial embarrassment that now Paul is being very nice to me. He's nice and a very on the level, straight sense. Like whenever there's something like happening in the apple, he explains to me as if I should know. I can see that he's just now suddenly changing his attitude, like he's treating me with respect, not because it's me, but because I belong to John. I hope that's what it is, because that would be nice. And I feel like he's my younger brother or something like that. I'm sure that if he had been a woman or something, he would have me a great respect, because there's something definitely very strong between John and Paul.
What we see here is that Yoko was very aware and conscious of the connection that John and Paul shared, even going as far to say that if Paul was a woman, he'd be a great threat. This recording also demonstrates another thing, that Yoko was completely unaware of Paul's frustrations with her, and that Paul, after some initial quote, embarrassment, respected her. We'll close with one last funny little snippet.
And I suddenly looked at Ringo, and Ringo was looking at me, and he sort of smiled and nodded. He probably thinks I'm just crazy. It's just having a microphone on her mouth and not saying anything. And sort of... Now George is looking at me, smiling too. I must really look crazy when I have a microphone with me.
In my head, I read this as both Ringo and George being like, what the fuck is she doing? Before awkwardly smiling. Yoko does seem to recognize this, to some degree, but doesn't seem to recognize that to them, it's not some funny little thing, but an aggravation.
Ringo and George, I just can't communicate. I mean, I'm sure that George and I'm sure that both are very nice people. That's not the point. I think that's because being air signs like Libra, Gemini, and Aquarius.
While she boils it down to astrology, this corroborates another fact, that Ringo and George never made much attempt to connect to Yoko, whereas Paul did a little bit, but still, Yoko seems unaware as to the real reason why. It is interesting to contemplate John's perspective during this time. You know that there must have been some degree of awareness of the effect it was having on the band. But by rejecting Yoko, John felt that they were rejecting him as well. Perhaps he thought they'd come around, recognize how important she was to him, and maybe they did a little bit, but never did they allow Yoko in the inner circle, which was what John so desperately wanted. All this focus on John and Yoko. What was Paul up to? He was engaged to Jane Asher, right? Paul always kept his public image and behavior highly manicured. It was just his nature. But behind the scenes, Paul's life was falling into disarray. His and Jane's relationship had always been unsteady. Jane wanted a career. Paul didn't want her to. Paul was also kindly referred to by those close to him as a, quote, compulsive coxman. That means exactly what you think it does. When he proposed to Jane in December of 1967, many close to him thought he was overcompensating or trying to manifest some change in himself. Jane herself seemed dead set on following through with it, accompanying Paul to India despite having next to no interest in the whole ordeal. From what I can tell, something significant happened between the end of May and the first couple of weeks of recording the White Album, and that something may have just been an American woman named Francie Schwartz. According to Peter Brown, an American girl from New Jersey named Francie Schwartz turned up at Apple offices. She wore jeans, no makeup, and her hair needed to be washed. She had a letter and a script she wanted Paul McCartney to read. Barbara usually sent these girls on their way, but in some unexplained gesture of kindness, she told Francie Schwartz to come back in the afternoon when Paul was in. The girl who returned to the office several hours later was completely transformed from the ragamuffin who had come through the door earlier. Francie had spent the day buying a dress and having her hair done. Barbara Bennett introduced her to Paul, who took her into his office. Later, they went out for cocktails, and then she spent the night at St. John's Wood. Within the week, Paul requested that Francie be given a job at Apple, and amidst much resentment, she was installed at a corner desk in the publicity department. 3 weeks went by as Francie served no special purpose other than being Paul's bird. It seemed that she was firmly ensconced in the house on Cavendish Avenue, until one night Jane came home unexpectedly. The regular crew of groupies who stood in front of Paul's house when he was in residence tried to warn him over the house intercom, but he thought they were playing a joke on him. Just as had happened to Cynthia before her, Jane discovered another woman in her bathrobe. Jane stormed out of the house a few moments later and drove off in her car. Mrs. Asher arrived later that night to pick up Jane's clothing, dishes, and pots and pans. It would be over a month before Jane went on live television and announced to the world that her and Paul's engagement was no more. In the meantime, at EMI Studios, things just continued to get messier. Ringo and George, seemingly already over the bullshit after 1 week of recording, flew to Los Angeles to escape. George would reconvene with Ravi Shankar and once again participate in the filming of the documentary Raga. So left behind in London to record were John, Yoko, Paul, and Francie Schwartz. Yes, and what was without a shadow of a doubt an act of retaliation to Yoko's presence, Paul decided to have his new fling join him in the recording studio. It was at this same point that John and Yoko began work on the infamous Revolution No. 9. Which Paul declined to have any part of. Thus began a new practice for the band, one which became the norm throughout these sessions. They would simply occupy different spaces, different studios, and work on their own songs when they wanted to. So while John and Yoko plugged away on Revolution No. 9, Paul began work on Blackbird.
Blackbird fly.
There has been a lot of time spent on John's behavior during this period, his episodes, his infatuation with Yoko, and his drug abuse, but Paul, frankly, was nearly just as bad. For a brief period, Francie lived inside of his home and was full witness to much of his behavior. When John came over, she recounted, all he could talk about was how much he loved Yoko. That disturbed Paul. In spite of John's obvious happiness, Paul stifled his jealousy with not very cute burst of crap. Longtime Beatle crony and current Apple press officer Derek Taylor said, I don't think I ever hated anyone as much as I hated Paul in the summer of 1968. He remembered Paul gathering the staff together and saying, don't forget, you're not very good, any of you. You know that. don't you? Neil Aspinall was still struggling to make sense of the Beatles' legal commitments and maintain some form of control over Apple's daily operations. Neil would come to my room in Apple in the middle of the day and collapse on the sofa and sit staring and staring. He tells me now it was fear.
It might have been exciting for everybody else and for people that came in from the outside. For me, it was a lot of hard work setting it up and a lot of chaos.
The Beatles' most developed branch of Apple so far, that being the Apple Boutique, was not making money. It was bleeding money. They lost the equivalent of $3 million in 7 months of operation, a number which seems nearly impossible. The boutique was initially opened as a partnership with design collective The Fool, who, over the course of these 7 months, repeatedly charged Apple for work they did not appear to be performing. And the garments they did actually supply to the shop were frequently removed without justification. Apple considered suing The Fool, but to avoid the embarrassment and costly litigation, simply cut ties. The Fool would run off to America, and were basically never heard of again. As soon as George and Ringo returned from California, Paul himself jetted off to America to perform some more promotional duties. At least, that was the convenient excuse. Beatles publicist Tony Bramwell recalls, "We literally rushed to the airport to get flights, and since we couldn't get a direct flight to LA, had to make a stopover in New York. The first thing Paul did on arrival at Kennedy was to dig out that check with Linda's number on it that, tellingly, he had carefully kept in his wallet. She was out, so he got our answering service. 'Hey, I'm in America. Come and hang out for a couple of days. I'm staying at the Beverly Hills Hotel.' On the 22nd, Paul would deliver a short speech and promotional film before the Capitol Records team. Tony continues, 'Relieved at how well it had gone, we were ready to return to the hotel and leap into the swimming pool again. When we went into the bungalow to change, followed by the trail of girls, we were rather surprised to find Linda, totally spaced out, waiting for Paul. She had a joint in one hand and a beatific smile on her face. Paul immediately detached himself from the circus surrounding him and took Linda aside. As I looked across the room, I suddenly saw something happen. Right before my eyes, they fell in love. Paul was struck almost dumb as he and Linda gazed at each other. They would spend much of the next few days together. It was silently decided at that point that they were meant to be together. When Francie Schwartz was cast aside, she was not happy, having been fully subjected to the full extent of Paul's antics. She would later write, probably rightfully so, that he was petulant, outrageous, adolescent, a little Medici prince, powdered and laid on a satin pillow at a very early age. While Paul had been away, John and Yoko continued work on Revolution No. 9. Even George got in on the fun a little bit. There was a long night spent at the mixing console, John fading in and out different elements of the piece, with Yoko and the engineers providing support. John became frustrated at points, but never lashed out. By the time he was finished, he was quite proud of his work. So naturally, when Paul arrived back from America, John played him the piece. Engineer Jeff Emmerich recalls, "I could see from the dark cloud that came over Paul's face that he was totally underwhelmed with Revolution No. 9, and there was an awkward silence after the track faded out. John looked at Paul expectantly, but Paul's only comment was, 'Not bad,' which I knew was a diplomatic way of saying that he didn't like it. 'Not bad,' John said. 'You have no idea what you're talking about. In fact, this should be our next bloody single. This is the direction the Beatles should be going in from now on.'" Over the next couple of days, the Beatles would come together to record John's "Everybody's Got Something to Hide, Except for Me and My Monkey." And for the first time since the sessions began, they seemed to fall back into rhythm, producing a ripping, tight piece of rock and roll. But a dark cloud began to loom over the horizon before finally moving in. It was time to record a new song, Paul's Obla Di Obla Da. Contrary to popular belief, the group had fun with the song initially. That first day was relatively light, but frustrations grew as take after take was performed, each one not to Paul's satisfaction. And unlike what was typically the case, where Paul was demanding but decisive, he himself did not seem to know what he wanted from the track. It was during the recording of this song that John and Paul would have their first very vocal, very loud confrontation. Jeff Emmerich would recall the following. "Throughout the preceding weeks, I had noticed that John's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. His mood swings were more severe, and they were occurring more frequently. That was definitely the case with the recording of Obla D. One moment he'd be into it, acting the fool. The next minute he'd be sulking and grumbling about how the song was more of Paul's granny music shit. So when Paul announced several nights later that he wanted to scrap everything that had been done so far and start the song again from scratch, John went ballistic. Ranting and raving, he headed out the door, with Yoko trailing closely behind. And we thought that we'd seen the last of him that evening. But a few hours later, he stormed back into the studio, clearly in a highly altered state of mind. "I am fucking stoned. I am more stoned than you have ever been. In fact, I am more stoned than you will ever be. And this is how the fucking song should go." He lurched down the stairs and over to the piano and began smashing the keys with all his might, pounding out the famous opening chords that became the song's introduction. A very upset Paul got right in Lennon's face. For a moment, I thought fist might fly. "Okay then, John, let's do it your way." As angry as he was, I think deep down inside Paul was flattered that his longtime collaborator had given the song any thought at all, even though he had obviously done so while getting out of his skull. The remake was, I had to admit, quite good. It had a bouncier feel to it than the original version, which seemed a bit leaden by comparison. And when it was completed, we all breathed a sigh of relief that we wouldn't have to be working on the song anymore. Before we continue, let's get into a little bit of speculation. We all know that Yoko introduced John to heroin. What is highly disputed though, mostly by John and Yoko themselves, was when this occurred. Throughout the years, they have attempted to downplay Yoko's role in introducing John to the drug, as well as the scope of their addiction. When speaking about Happiness is a Warm Gun, both John and Yoko insisted that it made no reference to heroin, and that John had never even taken the drug at that point.
And it went through the different styles of rock, and it also was about a gun, not about heroin or anything. And those days I had no idea about heroin. I'd never seen it, nor knew anybody that had ever touched it or taken it.
That seems unlikely to me. Stoned, nowadays, is almost always in reference to marijuana, but back then, it was much more of a catch-all. For example, here's reference to John saying how he was, quote, stoned out of his mind on heroin during the Let It Be sessions.
You know, and I was stoned all the time too on H, etc.
There's the erratic behavior, which is not typically associated with pot. Uppers, sure, but the Beatles had abused those for years, without the engineers making much reference to extreme mood swings. All of this amounts to the following. John was most likely using heroin fairly early on into the White Album sessions. The Beatles' abuse in the studio wasn't just reserved for each other, but for the engineers as well. Jeff Emmerich and George Martin, who for years had maintained a working relationship with the boys that stretched far beyond the usual duties of engineer and producer and into the realm of creative collaborators, now found themselves othered and relegated to a tier of definitive inferiority. This eventually all came to a head. On this day, Paul decided that he wanted to re-record his lead vocal for Obla D for about the 10th time. The engineers, while far from excited about it, dutifully got to work, and George Martin, as he always had, did what he could to smooth the process along. George Martin asked if Paul could try rephrasing the last line of each verse. Martin's suggestion didn't make Paul happy. "If you think you can do it better, why don't you fucking come down here and sing it yourself?" George Martin was stunned. He turned pale, clearly choking back his anger and humiliation. What happened next was a shock. George Martin began shouting, "Then bloody sing it again! I give up!" It was the first time I had ever heard George Martin raise his voice in a session. The silence following the outburst was equally deafening. That was it for me. I took one last glance down at the studio, where McCartney was standing defiantly, and decided that this just wasn't worth it. I simply had to escape the pressure cooker. Somehow I saw the session through to its ragged conclusion. Paul seemed to calm down a bit, though little else got accomplished that night. Weary to the bone, I made my way home and tried to catch some sleep, but after a few hours of tossing and turning, I knew what I had to do. The next afternoon, I walked dejectedly into the control room. None of the other Beatles had arrived yet. They were late, as usual. I took a deep breath, and at last the words came out. "That's it, George," I announced. "I've decided I can't take it anymore. I'm leaving." With that, Jeff Emmerich, who had done so much significant work with the Beatles, was out of the picture. The Apple Boutique was an abject failure. It was decided to end the entire operation. Rather than liquidate the store for whatever they could get, the Beatles chose to give everything away. A long line stretched all around the block. The building was emptied. There was still one small glimmer of hope, however. Apple Records. And the Beatles' first release under the label was a single, Hey Jude. Initially, John fought to have his faster, dirtier remake of Revolution as the A-side. But once he heard Hey Jude, even he conceded that it deserved the spot. There was a rare bit of tenderness exhibited here. John read in the lyrics of the song some form of acceptance from Paul, some spurring acknowledgement of his relationship with Yoko. But in reality, it was a lyric conceived in the wake of hurt John had left behind him in his pursuit of Yoko, abandoning his wife Cynthia and his son Julian. Paul had always been, and especially during this period, a selfish man. But no man is any one thing. Paul felt terribly about the way Cynthia and Julian had been cast aside. They had been a part of Paul's life too. So Paul decided to make a visit to the two. And it was after which that Hey Jude came to him. The single was a resounding success. Hey Jude was an instant classic, a powerful and resonant song. Could there be a path forward? Could the Beatles simply let go of Apple, let go of their resentments, at least enough to produce music? We all know the answer. Even the release of Hey Jude, with all of its success, produced a bit of dark comedy. To help publicize the release of Hey Jude, Paul decided to put the closed Apple boutique to some good use, writing Hey Jude on the windows in large letters. The following morning, when the neighborhood shopkeepers arrived to open their stores, they were incensed. They took it as an anti-Semitic slur. A brick was thrown through the store window before the words could be cleaned off and the misunderstanding straightened out. One thing that wasn't straightened out, though, was the Beatles' behavior in the studio. Jeff Emmerich's dramatic departure had no effect. For every moment of unity, of combined brilliance, there were 5 arguments. They spent an agonizing 97 takes on George's Not Guilty, an excellent song that nonetheless did not make the album, probably because the song itself was a lashing directed at the other Beatles. Shortly after that, they recorded John's Sexy Sadie, a song specifically targeted at the Maharishi. Then John presented a song he had written with Magic Alex, titled What's the New, Mary Jane? A song that Paul hated even more than Revolution number 9.
What a shame, Mary Jane, what a shame, Mary Jane had a pain at the...
Eric Clapton was brought into play on George's While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and the extent of his contribution was more significant than any other guest of a Beatles track. George was very pleased with Eric's performance, as well as his own small act of defiance, having another musician play on a Beatles record to this degree. While John and George had the ability to fire back at Paul when he got on their nerves or was demanding, Ringo was not. This is not to diminish Ringo's role in the band, but he had always been at the whim of the others to a much larger degree. And Paul was more directive to Ringo than ever before, often having him step aside so Paul could show him how he wanted it played. And this didn't just stir an anger in Ringo, but an insecurity. Ringo knew his role in the band was important, but he was also very much aware that he was the most discardable of the 4. And on August 22nd, this all boiled over. Ringo quit the band.
I felt 2 things. I felt I wasn't playing great, and the other 3 were really happy, and I was an outsider. And so, I came to this decision, fuck it, I'm leaving.
He decided to treat himself to a well-earned break. He borrowed Pete Sellers' yacht and spent much of the 2 weeks at sea, recovering physically and emotionally. It was actually during this period that he began writing Octopus's Garden.
And I knew we were just in a messed up stage, all of us. Then, it wasn't just me, it was the whole thing was going down. And I came back and went in the studio, and George had it decked out with flowers. It's just flowers everywhere, and John had sent me telegrams saying, "You're the best rock drummer, come on home." and I just felt good about myself again, and we'd got through that little crisis, and it was great. And then the White Album really took off, and like Year Blues, the track Year Blues was great. We all left the studio and went to a little room, so there's no separation, and there was lots of group activity going down. I loved the White Album.
but work had continued while he was gone. The drumming on both Back in the USSR and Dear Prudence was performed by Paul, who admittedly did a bang-up job. For the next month, the Beatles did okay. They recorded some fantastic rhythm tracks and had a good time with it, such as was the case with Paul's Helter Skelter. John's Glass Onion was banged out in no time. That gave George some attention with Piggies. Birthday was written and recorded in one day. Happiness is a Warm Gun was a marvel that challenged the band's ability. Eventually, though, the cloud returned. The bulk of the music recorded during the month of October was done so in separate studios.
There was a lot more individual stuff. For the first time, I think people were accepting that it was individual. Like, I remember having 3 studios operating at the same time. You know, Paul was doing some overdubs in one, and John was doing something in another one, and I was doing horns on something else in another studio.
Then there were a number of arguments surrounding the sequencing of the album, and the inclusion of tracks such as Revolution No. 9 and Paul's Wild Honey Pie. It had been the longest, most grueling, hellacious recording sessions the Beatles, or probably just about anyone, had ever experienced. Somehow, out of all of this, they still produced in my mind a masterpiece. Undoubtedly, their most unique work, and one I consider amongst their best. On October 16th, the last bit of mixing for the LP was completed. The very next day, John and Yoko were arrested on drug possession. Thank you all so much for watching. If you would like to continue this story, please consider subscribing. I'll be releasing these videos every 2 weeks. I also have a large number of videos recounting the Beatles' history and the making of their albums, if you want to see more. Want to watch part 6 of the series right now? You can do so by joining my Patreon for only $1 a month. It's a wonderful way to support the channel, and I would like to take a moment to personally thank all of my Patreon supporters. With that, thank you so much for watching. Until next time.